Alright, so here I am with my object, and I have all the UVs laid out all over this entire thing. Alright, so if I spin around, I can see there's the screws, here's all these parts. And again, before we even go into Mari, we just want to double check, scoot things off, look behind things, make sure all the UVs are laid out the exact way you'd want them to be laid out, okay? Because we don't want to have to keep going back and forth, trying to get this thing to work. Keeping in mind, too, that eventually this thing is going to be animated, so it's going to be this exploded view, okay? So you can see on some of these, like this guy right here, I don't have the UVs laid out. So I want to make sure that I grab that and lay out the UVs for it. And then, of course, I want to go into the UV texture editor, size it accordingly, and then move it into somewhere that's not going to be right here, okay? So I'm pretty sure, let me just shuffle this off. I'm pretty sure I have some room up top-ish. So if I grab everything, I can see right there I have some room, okay? So I can grab this and just slide it right in there. Okay, these two guys I can actually shuffle down. Oops. And to put just one there, not a negative one. There we go. And then you want to also consolidate. The more you can consolidate your stuff, the better. But we can't go through and just start randomly just like squeezing things in. They should fit in a perfect spot. So look at this. Perfectly, this fits in right here. That's what we want. And now I have room here. I can take this guy and shuffle him off over there. And you look around and see if there's stuff that you could reorganize. Look at this texture right here. You can see all these are just little pieces. Okay, and again, look at all the other areas too that are maybe that you can squeeze these guys in a little bit closer. Okay, we don't want any overlapping. We don't want anything hanging off of these grid spots. Okay, and I'm going to start taking some of these other ones. Just finding a nice little home for them. The less squares you have, the less textures you're going to be using, the better. Okay, because things will just work quicker because it's not going to have to write out every single thing. Alright, so let me see, I can probably take these two guys and drag those up there. I can probably take some of these little pieces. Oops. Make sure I grab the shells. Go. And then I'm just going to take these guys here and pull them down. Okay, so before I'm even going to think about going into Mari, I just want to do another double check, and I remember, turn my textures off here. Whoa. I do have some overlap right here, so I'm just going to grab these parts here, grab their shell. I meant to grab all of these and that. There we go. Oops, torn this into a couple pieces. Might be easier to grab this stuff. There we go. So that pulls that off. And again, I'm just going to find a nice little spot for these guys where they're not overlapping anything. Obviously there's overlap here, so I want to just adjust these. So I'm going to grab these, grab the shells, and just try to find a nice spot for these out of the way. If I look over here, I can probably fit these over here. Okay. Also, I'm going to look at the edges. See how close that is to the edge? I don't want it to be that close to the edge. So I'm going to adjust that. I have plenty of room on here. I'm going to adjust it, slide it over a little bit. Same thing with this guy. Okay, just rearranging these makes it a lot easier to rearrange these guys. Okay, and you can see how nicely they fit right there. No overlapping. Again, double check one at a time, go through these, spend a little bit of 5 minutes, 10 minutes or so, just going through and making sure all your UVs are set up right. Look at this guy. And check the edge here. Yeah, see that edge should be merged. There we go. And I can just kind of straighten out that edge. Good. Alright, so now everything else looks like it's good. Okay, so now I'm ready. So let me just save this as. Output. Okay. Now it does no good to edit your UVs if nothing's ever gonna be in the same spot. We always have to make sure that the changes we made to the UV editor are going to be saved on this. Alright, so now I just rewound this back to the beginning at frame 1. I'm going to delete my animation on here because I don't need it. You won't have any at this point. Alright, so there I have my parts, and I'm just going to go to group them. Right, Saber. And I'm going to File, Export Selection. Now in here I have this option to do an OBJ export. Okay, if you don't have that option, you have to go to Window, Settings, Preferences, Plugin Manager, and turn on OBJ export. It's right here, OBJ export. Load and auto load. Now I can go in here and export this selection. Light Saber _ to Mari. Okay, I can just minimize Maya for a minute and then go into Mari and just verify that everything is cool. Okay, I don't want to close Maya yet because there might be something that I need to change, and I want to make sure that it's set up correctly before I do that. As I start working inside of Mari, I want you to take specific notes as to hotkeys I'm using and where buttons are, because it's very easy to get lost in a new program, especially when you go into something from Maya and you're coming into Mari. It's it's a little bit different. All right, so what we need to do is I'm going to make a new document. And also, before I even start that, I've had to adjust my resolution of my screen. Typically, I'm at a lower resolution when I record my videos. So I'm at a bigger resolution because of Mari's interface. It wants a big resolution. So I'm going to give it that. So I'm going to call this lightsaber underscore texture. For the path, it wants the path of my geometry. So I'm just going to go find my geometry. There it is. Okay. And it wants to know my root path. So I'm going to give it a root path. And I'm just going to take this path there. Doesn't work at all. Desktop, D drive. And for now, I'm going to throw it into my source. Okay, and I have an instructional folder inside source. I'm just going to make a new one. Okay, and then say choose. And what that means is all my textures and stuff that I create are going to be saved into this folder. Okay. A couple things to pay attention to. Mapping scheme, UV if available. So we've already laid out the UVs, so we want to use those UVs. Selection sets, it says create from face groups. That's not going to be a huge deal because we can create those after. I can just hit don't create for now. Multiple geometries per object. This is just the default. Okay. Now we're going to create a color map. So we're going to say create color. And here's the different resolutions. Typically you want to start off with a big resolution because you can always resize it later. Okay. If I started at 512 and I realized it wasn't big enough or detailed enough, then that wouldn't obviously work. So we're going to start at 4096, and if we needed to lower our resolution, we can lower our resolution later. You could obviously paint this at a really high resolution, really add a lot of detail, but it would just go super slow. So I'm going to stick with 4096, and that should be plenty. The type is color, meaning that we're getting red, greens, and blues. If it was scalar, we would just get black and whites basically. File space, normal, we'll just leave it like that. And fill, we can fill it with the default color. We're just going to leave that, doesn't matter. And then for depth, we'll leave it at 8-bit for now. Okay, we really not for this assignment anything that we need to change for the bit depth. If you do go with 32, obviously you're going to have better files, but again, you're going to have that slow down speed hit. Okay, so for now we'll just leave it at 8. So I'm going to hit OK. It's going to bring in my model, and the first thing I want to do is just verify everything's there. Okay, if you accidentally made something wrong, then obviously you want to go ahead and fix that. This face came out really faceted because inside Maya, if I were to click on that face and hit 1, that's what it looks like. All these other ones are actually smoothed out. Okay, so that's not going to be a huge deal because there's not very much change from one to the other. So I'm just going to leave it in 1 with this rough state. Okay, that'll be fine. Everything else looks like it's there. I got all my screws there. I got all my other parts there. I'm moving around just like the Maya interface. Okay, so Alt left is to orbit around, Alt middle is to pan, and Alt right is to zoom. Okay, and a lot of your hotkeys will be here. There's a lot of options and stuff here that will really help. Over here I have my lights turned on. I can just hide that by just closing that window. Over on the left is all your toolbars. I'm only going to use a portion of these, but they're all over here. There's also a little arrow down in the bottom. If I click that, I will get, just like Photoshop has, a background color, which is here, my foreground color, which is there. I have a swapper, so I can swap between them. And then I have, this default color right there. Okay, I have a selection tool, so this allows me to select different pieces of my geometry. Okay, so you see how I grabbed the screw and it grabbed all the screw parts. It also grabs some of this inside stuff here. That's not a big deal. That's just some of my other settings that I have. Okay, there's also a marquee, there's a transform paint buffer tool, a zoom, whatever. We don't really need to worry about too many of these. We're going to focus on just a key set. Okay. Also, I'm in the orthographic. There's also a perspective, and you typically don't want to work in perspective because it will basically, as you're painting, it'll paint that way. I like to work in orthographic. That way, I get a pretty flat object here. There's also the UVs, so we can take a look at the UVs as it's painting it. Okay, and again, we can verify that the UVs came in the correct way, and they did. And that's that. Okay, so as we work, obviously we want to go to File and save this throughout. All right, so over here on the right, this is here's our channel, which is color, and we can create multiple color channels here. I could also click, if I click this button, it'll open up the layers for the color, which are the same thing as this thing down there. All right, so here's my channel, here's my layers. Here's my image manager, and as I bring in images, this is where they're going to go. So when I paint metal, I want the metal textures to be imported here so I can drag them and drop them onto this. Here are some shaders. Typically I don't need to play with these, but just so you can see that are there. If we needed to, we can adjust some of the coloration just to give us a better idea of what this is looking like. Okay. Again, these are all just for preview. None of this stuff is really going to matter once we take it out and bring it back into Maya, because we're going to set up our own diffuse and specular and roughness and all that. Okay. And then our shelf is where all of our brushes are. Okay. And you could download new brushes. You can see I've downloaded Brad's brushes, and if I were to click on one of them, and then I went to my paintbrush, there we go. There we go. So you can see what Brad's brush looks like right here. Or I can click on this one. This is, what the tongue looks like. Here's Jack Frost. So we have like some snow pattern. Some wiggly things. All right. So it's just a matter of downloading these, and then you drop them right into it. Okay. You could just right click and load the shelf or import a shelf. And that would bring those images in there. And these are actually the same thing as a Photoshop brush. It's just a black and white image that they've used to create this specific thing. So there's that and so on. Okay. All right. So we'll be dipping in and out of those as well. Here's our layers. Okay. So down here is layers. Again, we create new layers by going to this new paint layer. Okay. So we can add new paint layers. Remove layers. There we go. We can obviously turn the eyeball off, turn the eyeball on to see different things. We can change the mode. There are layer masks, so there's a layer mask right there. There are adjustment layers, so we can add that too. There's procedural layers, so if I wanted just to add, let's see, environment, procedural, cloud. Okay, so I just added this cloud texture, and you can see that just overall adds this cloud texture to the entire thing. And I could tone that down, pull it up. I could add a mask to this and start painting it. Alright, so it's a lot of cool stuff that we can do. Projection, this is where we're going to, let me turn my brush back to a regular brush, it'll drive me crazy. Our projection is where, or our, projection, we want to say mask preview enabled. Okay, so we want to turn that on, and by default it may not do this. Okay, so what it's doing is under the edge mask here, scroll down, so there we go, I've adjusted my fall off end, and this is going to kind of soften the transition of what we're doing. As we start painting inside here, it's going to do what's called projection painting, so it's basically projecting the paint. But as we get closer to the edges, it'll start to stretch and streak over the edges. So we keep this edge mask on so it doesn't allow us to paint right at the edge, because we shouldn't. Our goal is that we paint and then we roll. We paint and roll, paint and roll, paint and roll. That way we get a nice image of what that's going to look like. Nice, flat, solid image. Okay. So that's what the edge mask is. Now there's a bunch of other ones here, and a lot of these are ones you can just kind of play with as well. There's a back face mask, which nothing set up. There's a fractal noise mask, which if I turn this on, now we have this fractally noise. So the red is where we can't paint. So then as I start painting on this, and I'll just paint something, really quick, or I won't because I don't have anything selected. There we go. You can see how I'm painting on here, and it's just painting in those specific areas. Let me turn my mask visibility off just so you can see this. All right, so you can see how there's a little bit of cloudiness happening right here. All right, so I'm just gonna hit undo. I don't need to save that. All right, but it's good to have the mask at least enabled so you can see what it's doing, and then you can obviously tweak it from there. Okay, and of course there's settings for each one of these that you can adjust to get the desired results. Okay, so click it off, click it on, right there. All right, there's another thing we want to pay attention to here. Where it says projection, it says project on front or project through. Okay, the default is set to through, meaning that if I start to paint here, it's going to paint. It's thinking, there we go. It's going to paint on this side as well. Okay, and we may not want that to happen. So typically I keep this on front. That way I'm controlling where I'm painting. Okay. Also, the default is projected set to paint on all. Now I typically don't want to paint on all because as I'm painting the edge of this, I don't want to paint this other part. Okay, so I say just the selected, and then I can hold down the S key for select, click an item, and let go, and now I'm just painting on that one specific item. Okay, it really allows me a lot of control as I'm painting on this one item. Okay. Now also, if I look at this, if I go to, I'm painting on the front and I start to paint this, and then I spin around, okay, the second you spin around, it's going to write that information to that texture. Now I'm going to go into my UVs and look at that texture, and you'll see that the texture actually only painted around that item. It didn't paint through that item. Okay, so if I switch back to this, I can go to selection and say hide unselected, and you'll see that it painted that specific item, but it didn't paint through that bar. So that's where you have to, if I show all, that's where you would have to hide that item and show it. Now there should be, if we're doing something like rust, let's say, the rust wouldn't be throughout underneath this thing. The rust would simply be, you know, on the outside of it, or maybe there creeps in a little bit, but not, you know, to that point. But if we're doing metal, the metal base color should be through the entire thing. So there's times when we will want this effect to happen, and there's times when we won't want this effect to happen. Okay, so typically we're going to leave this on selected only, and we'll leave this on front, and that's where we're going to go. Okay. All right, so now we're actually going to start painting this thing. So the first thing we want to do is you want to go to layers and make sure you have a layer here. And I have a couple that I've already built that we can visit after we're done. But you want to have at least one layer, and you can see the buttons down here, and if you just hover your mouse over it, you can see exactly, you know, what they're going to do if you ever get lost. Okay, so I made a new layer. I called it base color, and it's pretty simple once you understand the concepts of what we're doing. Alright, so before we start painting anything, I want to go through and I want to go to my projection, and I want to make sure that these settings are set up. Now I'm going to be constantly revisiting these things. So projection here, it says front. For now I'm going to leave it on. Project on selected only, I'm going to leave that on too. Also I have the edge mask, so I'm going to just leave that on for now. Okay. So I'm constantly going to be visiting here and changing the projection front, the project on selected only, the edge mask on and off, and then I may even play with some of these other ones there. Also, I'm going to be coming up here to my brushes under the shelf and changing which brush I'm using. Okay. So for now, let's just go through and fill it with some basic color. So the other spot I'm going to use is Image Manager. And in here I've loaded in some images that I've already kind of set up. This one here is just as bare metal. If I just drag it into my work area, you can see what it looks like. I can hold Control Shift and just shrink it down. Remember that the hotkeys are right here along this bar. Okay, now you'll see that this is not a square texture. I do have a square version of this. I brought it into Photoshop and just cropped it. Just doot, 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 perfectly square. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use this one here to fill this whole thing with the base color, because I want to go through and have just a default color on this entire thing. So I went into Photoshop, cropped it, and then brought it back in by just using this import. So now I can right click and say quick copy. Then I'm going to go to my UVs. I'm going to hold down S and just marquee all this. Okay, so I've selected basically all of those pieces. Then under patches, fill, I'm going to say, sorry, not patches. We want patches, but I want to go patches, quick paste. And I can quickly paste this onto these patches. I hit OK. And it's going to take this texture and just drop it right into this square. Alright, so then now as I zoom in, you can see that each one of these patches has that texture on it. Right? So if I wanted this to be smaller or whatever, I would have to take this image and make it smaller inside Photoshop and then bring it back in. Okay, but the point is that it gives me just a base color. Alright, so I'm not starting off with just a plain gray, I'm starting off with this metal color inside here. And so now my next step in here is to go through and just start selecting individual pieces and start painting them. Alright, let me go to my image that I have. Alright, so I'm looking at this and I'm seeing, okay, this is like a reflective metal. Okay, now I'm not going to paint reflections on here, that'll all come inside Maya. What I am going to paint in is, if I zoom into these areas, you can see the coloration of this. Okay, you can see how there's some scratches here. I can see that the scratches are going vertically, so you know, if my texture allows it, I can take that into account. There's some rust that's going to happen down here. The rust is actually going to be a separate thing, because I would imagine this would be have a little bit of depth to it apart from just the regular color. So my base color, all I want to do is focus in on what this base color is, something like this. That's kind of like a nice area to kind of look at as I'm viewing that. Now I have essentially two main textures on here, three if I count these little sockets here. Is I have this black, which looks like a painted metal. I have this shiny brushed metal, and then I have this golden corroded metal a little bit. Okay, there's also the glass here. A lot of this texture will come inside of Maya, not inside of here. Okay, but those are the three basic colors I'm going to use. So inside Mari, I actually have the rust. I have this blue. I have this blue here. I have a black, and I'm just going to use all those. So I'm just going to go through and just paint all of these things individually, one at a time. So I see that this is brushed metal, so I'm going to brush metal this. Now I don't want to just start painting on here, because if I do, it's going to start painting over everything. Okay, so what I want to do is I'm going to hold down S and I'm going to click on this piece. Now based on my settings up here is what I'm going to get. So I want to choose, let's see what this is. This one is select by object. That's just going to be the whole thing. This one is select by patches, and what that means is by UV patches out here. So when I selected that, it selected everything inside that patch. If I grab this one, it's select by faces. Okay. Now I could hold down shift and grab multiple ones, but sometimes you'll find that you're grabbing extra stuff here. That's not a huge deal. See, I'm grabbing the bars there because the bars share a similar thing. So it's not a huge deal. All right. So I want to isolate these to paint those. So I'm going to hit Shift H. And what that does is it hides everything else. So I only have this stuff visible. So now here's where I could help isolate this further, is I can now go to select by faces, hold down S, marquee these faces, and then go to Control H again, or Shift H again, and that will hide everything but this one piece. Okay, now I can just focus in on this. Now if I see that there's a dark area here, under Tool, View, Palettes, I can turn my lights on. There they are. And that's what this guy is. I like to have it up already. And then I can just turn my lights until I can see all the way around there. Okay. Maybe I'll play with this light. That light's good. Maybe I'll play with 4. I think 4 is a good one I could play with. There we go. I'm just trying to get some just flat lighting in here so I can see all the sides. Alright, so now that I have that, let me drag my image in again. And this one I'm not dragging in the square one, I'm dragging in my rectangle one. And then what I'm going to do is just go through with this project paint through image onto canvas, and I'm going to just paint onto there. Okay, so I'm going to give myself a little bit bigger brush, and then I'm just going to paint. And you'll see like this might be kind of repetitive, like why are we painting this, because we just filled it all, but you'll see that the texture of this new stuff that I'm putting on is nice and tiny. Now if we didn't do this other one, we really have to worry about getting every single spot. Where this one, I could kind of skip spots and it would be okay. You can see how if I just paint it around this. Okay. Now this spot right here I didn't paint, but that's probably going to be fine because it's, just part of that texture. Now one thing I want to keep in mind that I don't want to do is constantly zoom in and out. When I zoom out, you can see how big this texture is. If I start painting it, it's going to make it very big. Okay. I also don't want to be zoomed in too much and start painting it, because now it's just too much detail in there. Okay. I want to find a good happy medium. So I like to fill the screen with my part, and then just start painting it. Okay. Now this is where the edge mask is going to come in handy. I'm going to turn this on, and you can see how. Let me just get rid of the image for a second. You can see how we have this red line going around it. So that will allow me to go pretty much right to the edge. Okay, and it won't streak it. It'll just paint it nice and neat. Now with this specific way that I'm painting, right now I'm painting only on the front. I actually want to paint through the image and let it go all the way to the other side. Okay, because again, this is just a base color. It's not going to be anything specific where I need it to be a certain texture in a certain spot. Alright, so I paint a little bit and then I spin it around. Okay, I can move it, I just don't want to zoom in and out. Okay. Also, if I get too close to this edge, I'm not going to like that. So I can hold shift and just scoot the image over. There we go. Go right to the edge. Okay, spin it. And you'll see it's going to be a pretty easy process to go through and to paint all these pieces. It's just going to take a little bit of time. It might take you, 2 or 3 hours to do something like this. Alright, but by the time you're done with it, you'll be really an expert at selecting the stuff and painting stuff that you need to paint. Okay, which will really come in handy when you get to the detail stage, because you really need to be able to hone in on just those little bits of detail. Okay, so I think I'm good there. I'm going to spin around to the frontish. Start painting the texture here. Now this is going to be glass, so I don't need to worry too much about what that looks like. I'm just trying to get the rim of this. The other thing I can do is there's a start repeat image button right here, which is the semicolon. I can click that, and that will allow me to repeat the image. So let's just wait a second. There we go. So just to show you, if this image is off the canvas or off my item like this, never get the lighting to work in all 4 seconds. There we go. It's off like this and I start painting, you can see how it's just going to start painting straight across. And there might be a seam, but that's no big deal because I can always just wait for it to write it out. And then I can just cover that seam up. Okay. Alright, so this piece is pretty much done. I just want to go through and just double check it, make sure everything's looking good. Alright. Looks like I got everything. Alright, so now let's say I want to paint this front thing where the lens is going to be. So I can hold down S again, and I can click on one of the faces, and you'll see that it only grabs 2 of these faces. If I change my smart angle up here, make it even more. Nope, doesn't want to select them. Let's go with orientation. So crank that up. Now I should be able to grab them the way that I want to grab them. It's just being picky right now. Alright, I guess I'll just shift click to grab those. I gotta be careful because there's a tiny piece, a tiny little sliver. Okay, so I'm just shift clicking those to select them. Okay. Oops. You can see I accidentally selected stuff on the back side, so I hold down Control, and I can deselect those. Alright, so I just got that. So now I'm just going to drag in this blue glass color texture I have, scale it up, get from, pretty much a front view, and then just paint that on there. Now if I look at this and I say, there we go. If I look at this and say I really don't like that color blue, I can always change it after. That's not a huge deal. All I'm doing now is just getting a base coloration in here. Okay. This color would go into Maya, and then we could use it to drive something else. I could use it to drive a different color, different texture, some sort of coloration on that specific item. All right. So that's pretty good for that one. So now let's go through and I'm going to say all these things I'm doing: select, hide unselected, hide selected, show all. They're all right here. You'll just find it's going to be easier for you to use the hotkeys. Shift H is going to be hide unselected. Control Shift H is show all. Okay. So now let's look at that one piece that we brought in. Here's the one we just painted. You can see that the texture is 10 times better on here than it is on there. Okay. So that's what we're trying to do in this state, is just paint it nice and neat. Okay. So now I'm going to go to the next piece. All right. So I'm going to hold down S, go to Patches, and I'll just click on this piece. And you'll see that these two patches are broken up. So if I hold down Shift, I can click on that one. Now yours are going to be different. You have different patches and different spots and whatever else. So that's where mine are. Okay. So let's go to Selection, Hide Unselected. Let's go back with our bare metal, shrink it down some. And paint. Okay, I may want to shrink that down just a bit more. Okay, then we do the same process. We're going to paint and then roll. And then paint and then roll. Now I am seeing a seam there, but I'll show you in a second how easy it's going to be to take that off. Okay, and the reason I'm seeing a seam is just because my texture is not a tileable texture. It's just, a picture of metal. The edges, when put together, this side to that side, aren't lining up right. Okay, so here's how we get rid of that: is I just kind of position this sheet on top of that, and then I just kind of hit it in the middle, and that'll blend it in nice and neat. Pull it over here. There we go. Okay, so anywhere I see a seam, that's what I want to do. Maybe right here, could use a little seam cleanup. There we go. Okay, so that's pretty good. Now I do want to look at the sides too, because these areas are sometimes neglected, and that's kind of a giveaway in some of these. Now when I come down here and I start painting, you'll see that I'm actually not painting anything on those. So when I move my mouse up, okay, it doesn't look like the texture's nice and clean down here because it wasn't painting it. Okay, so that should be good on both sides because I had my projection through still on. Alright, so that piece is good. So you can see how quickly this is going. Control Shift H, bring everything back, compare the two textures. Yes, they look like they match. Alright, so now let me grab a different piece, because it's going to be the same thing for all these metal pieces, just grabbing those things. So let me grab this black piece here. So I'm going to hold down S, click on that, and you'll see that this piece is actually over several areas that I need to select. Okay. Alright, there we go. Shift H. Now you want to verify too that you have the piece in there, obviously. You'll see that I have several things going on here. I have my screws that are still inside this selection set, and then I have this piece of metal here. So I want to look at that and see, you know, do I want all of these? Do I want to hide anything? Here's another quick way that we can kind of select stuff, is if I hold down, I switched it to face, I go to S, and I grab these faces, then I can come over here with S still hit and just say grow. Okay, and you'll see it grew it right to there. So I'm going to hold down Shift and grab some more faces and let it grow it all the way around. There we go. Okay, so it looks like I have just those pieces selected. Then I can go to Selection and say Hide Unselected again. There we go. So now I'm just painting this. So then I would just go through and start painting it. So now this is going to be black. So I have this black metal. Okay, that's what it looks like. It's kind of scratched up a bit. I'm going to put it about there. Okay, try and get a good size for it. Also, I want to rotate this a bit. Okay, so I'm going to try to get it pretty much dead on like this, but have it painted like that. Okay, and again, my repeat is still on, and this one's going to be a little bit more apparent as to where my repeats are. Okay. And you can see that I could paint and paint and paint without having to move anything. I'm just trying to clean it up so it doesn't look too repetitive. Again, this is just a base texture. Okay. If I decide to darken this later, I can always darken it later. There's nothing saying that I, have to keep it that exact color that comes out of here. Just like Photoshop, if you want to darken something, you can go ahead and darken it, just like any other program. It's just a matter of knowing where to turn that on, turn it off. There we go. Now a couple other hotkeys, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you can see are automatically cycling between these. So you may want to use like 1, 2, 3, 4 to help paint your stuff. Obviously that could be a extreme help for some of your things that you're painting. And again, that when we filled it in at the beginning, any of the areas that we accidentally miss, like just as an example, let's say we accidentally didn't paint this tiny little piece right here. Well, that'll automatically get filled in by that texture we did at the beginning. There we go. Now again, we can look at this and say, I'm not liking this, I am liking this, whatever. You want to tweak it, you can tweak it. We can also come in and paint on here. This is your regular paintbrush, and I can pick a color. Let's say I painted black. We'll just go with black for now. And I went in here and I did, darken. Make my brush a bit bigger. I'm going to take my opacity down a touch. And you can see how I can just darken this texture overall. So like I said, we're not stuck with that default texture. We can adjust it as we see fit. Now I'm using a mouse for this too. Obviously your stylus, your tablet, would help you immensely kind of create a nice clean texture. So there we go. All right, so the more tools you have, the better it could turn out, but you don't absolutely need that kind of stuff. It's just a matter of being able to control your opacity and your radius and the rest of this to get that texture to look good. All right, so that's good. Also, an important thing to note is you want to stay consistent with your stuff. So the texture is going vertically with this, so I want to make sure I go vertically on other areas too, just so it looks like it's kind of all machined the same way. All right. All right, so let's bring everything back, Control-Shift-H, and I'm just going to continue the same process. Now when I get into stuff, just so you can see it, let me switch back to patches mode. For stuff like this, you'll see that my selection mode is actually being saved based on which mode I'm in. Okay, so right now I'm in patches mode, so it's selecting the patches that I just did. When I switch to faces, it's grabbing the faces that it saw me select. So if I'm trying to do these screws now, Shift H, I can do that same trick that I did before, where I go to my selection tool, switch it to faces, and I just grab the faces for all the stuff except for the screws. Oops. Do my little grow trick. I think I need to grab the face of this. And then I can say selection hide selected. And I can see, oops, I missed that, so I just grab that. Hide selected. And now I just have the screws on here, so now I can just marquee the screws, and now I can just paint right on top of the screws to get them to be whatever color I'm trying to get them to be. Okay? You always want to paint with a texture initially. That way you have a good starting point to go from. If you don't paint with a texture, it really leaves a lot to just a flat color, which typically doesn't turn out very good. Rotate that. Shrink that down to a bit. Also, looking at some of these, make it appropriate as far as size goes. This is actually a bit too small. All this detail would not be on one of those screws, so I want to make sure it's sized good and painted. Spin around. Zoom in, zoom out, make sure your stuff is looking good. Obviously not while you're painting, but as you're checking things out. Okay, and pieces like these screws, you really have to hit it from several angles to really get enough information to them. Alright, so let's go take a look and see what the screws look like. There we go. So they have some nice little texture parts on them. Okay. Alright, so screws are good. Control-Shift-H. And then we're just going to continue the same process for all of these pieces, for every single thing that's on here. Okay. Some of the stuff that you don't have to spend too much time on because you're going to be doing a lot of the texture inside of Maya is stuff like the light bulb here. Oops, patches again. Okay, so the light bulb here, a lot of texture is going to come from Maya, but we still want to give it some sort of coloration inside here. Okay, so I'm giving it some sort of texture inside of Mari, but I'm not going to be spending terribly a lot of time doing that. There we go. So that's pretty much all I'm going to do for the color of this. And because this is on its own patch, So if I go to UVs, once this is done thinking, here we go and see there's its own patch. It really allows me to go through and tweak this coloration and stuff afterwards. I can come in and just really adjust the coloring of it. When you have it on, one piece on several patches, it makes it a little bit trickier to do. Still possible, just a little bit trickier. Alright, so you're just going to go through this and just paint all the individual pieces. So if you need to, you can pause it. I'm going to just show you what mine looks like. So here's my base color. It's loading right now. Okay, and on this one I didn't spend any time coloring, some of these little parts. I just want to go over the major stuff. Okay, so you can see what the base color is going to look like. I've kind of really isolated what these different sections are doing. Okay, and that's really the important thing. If I zoom in, you can see the texture of the black here. You can see the texture of this, the screws. Okay, so you really get some nice texturing on there. All right. So now our next step after we're done with the base color, okay, so pause the video if you need to, go and do your base color, come back to the video when you're done. We're going to go through and add the rust, okay. So here is my rust layer. And there's no difference in what we did with the base than what we're doing with the rust. The only thing we're going to do is instead of painting it all over, we're just going to isolate, all right. So again, I'm going to first select an item. So I want to select this here, let's say, because that's where the screws are. That's where these pieces are. So that's what I want to paint on. All right. And I'm going to go through my rust and drag this on. Okay, shrink it down to an appropriate size, rotate it appropriately. I'm going to jump back to my projection. I don't want to paint through this time. I only want to do front. If I paint through, what would happen is that it would paint through this area onto this other side. I don't want that to happen. I want to just paint the front. Okay. Now instead of using this round soft brush, let me go to a blank area so you can see what it's going to look like. It doesn't really look like doesn't really look like rust. It just looks like an area that's been painted. I want to give it some texture. There we go. So I'm going to go to my shelf, and under my hard brushes, there's a couple brushes you might want to use. Like this one is a rusty blob. Okay, shrunken down, it could work. All right. So let me just go make a new layer. So I'll just hide my previous rust layer. And I'll make a new rust layer just so you can see it from scratch. Okay, place this where it should go. Shrink my rust brush down. And I'm just going to start painting. Okay. Now, the brush is actually maybe a little bit too small for this. I actually have a better one that works. This metal, can't read what the rest of the word is. Might say metal rust, I don't know. But this metal thing here works pretty good. Let's make it a little bigger. Okay. If this flickering bothers you, shift minus, and I can actually hide that item some. There we go. So what I'm doing is just kind of outlining where the rust would be for this. Like that. I could also take my opacity down, and that way I'm kind of building up the rust, and it's not just like, a start and stop kind of thing. It actually has some gradation to it. Okay, you see this rust looks a little bit nicer than that rust does. Okay, adding a little bit more detail to this can help out. Alright, so now I just scoop my stuff over, and good. Alright, so I do the same thing to this side. I would do the same thing anywhere where I wanted to add some of that rust. Or some of this just random, dirty texture underneath here. Now I'd imagine that it wouldn't actually rust. It's just kind of like a discoloration that happens due to these parts. Maybe they've trapped water underneath or whatever. I'm assuming that, Jedis kind of go lots of different places, and so they have this they have a lot of elements that touch it. Let's put it that way. Let's just put this here. There we go. Okay. So even though this is rusty color, I may change that afterwards. All right, now with this here like this, I'm going to go to Selection and Hide Unselected. And what you're going to see is that my rust goes right to those circles. And I don't want it to, because if my, once I pull the screws off, it's going to look weird to have nothing at all there. So once I've painted my texture, I want to go back and just kind of fill in some of this stuff. Okay. It doesn't have to be perfectly filled in. I just want to have something there so it looks like, it's not just a perfectly cut out circle of where the rust is and where the rust was. Okay, and for this I've zoomed in a bit just so I can really get the detail of it. If I find that my textures are not lining up good or they're looking funky, I can always scale up or down that image. Okay, so that's going to look a lot nicer than just having it with this circle outline right there. Okay, so you can see the process of this is that we're just putting this rusted coloration all over this metal. Okay, so then when we take this into Maya, we can actually bump this out, bump it in, whatever. It'll turn out pretty neat. All right, so that's what you're going to do. Let me bring everything else back. So anywhere you feel that there should be some rust, or I don't think there'd be rust right there. That doesn't really make sense. Typically rust is in areas where water gets trapped and starts leaking out. So areas like along here, we might have some rust or corrosion or something. You don't want to go overboard. You don't want to make every single area rusty. Be very selective with where you put your rust. All right. Now let's pretend that you've added your rust, but you really want to get rid of some of it. There is an eraser where we can go through and erase stuff. For some reason my eraser is not working. It's on there. Oh, my eraser is set to darken. There we go. Opacity's up, flows up, breeze. Alright, my eraser does not want to work right now. Alright, well, regardless. What we can do is another method, which is preferable, which is we can take this rust and we can come down here and add a layer mask. Okay? Which they call it a mask stack. It's a layer mask. So we just click that, and it adds this little stack to this. And now we're painting masks. So all we have to do is just go in here. I'll grab this brush again. And I'm just painting white where I want my texture to be, and black where I don't want that texture to be. Let me check my projection in front. Select only, yes. Edge mask. There it goes. I wasn't selected on apparently, so it wasn't painting. So now with this, I'm just going through and I could take out areas and add areas in. Okay, and if I want to bring areas back, switch it to white, and then I can just bring these areas back in. Okay, I do have to rotate around, or whatever, hit Alt, in order for that to bake in, so just be aware of that. Okay, so I want to take off all the rust. There it is. Switch back to white, paint it all back in. Now, one thing to be careful of with this is the first time I ever did this, I started going through and I was paint black. And I'd be like, okay, that's cool, and I would click on my new rust, and then it would cause this to be black. Okay, because right now it hasn't baked that texture in. I have to make sure that I'm clicked on this mask in order to make sure I'm painting that. Then when I start tumbling, it'll write that information out. Okay, so just be aware of that. It's a little bit tricky to get used to because we're used to kind of like Photoshop, where just, you know, it works, right? All right, so there we go. So there's our rust. So we would again go through and we would add rust to all of these different areas where we would have rust. Okay. Now we could also, like I said, adjust coloration. So there's also down here, there's a here's the layer mask. If you just wanted one mask, we've added the mask stack, which is more preferable because we can add other layers to this. Okay. I don't need other layers for this, but just want to get in the habit of using the layer stack for any of these. Here's an adjustment layer and an adjustment stack. So I can say I want to add an adjustment stack to this of, let's say, hue and saturation. Let's just say saturation. All right, so then we go to this thing, the stack. Here's the saturation. And then we can pull the saturation down, pull the saturation up, and you see how we're affecting it. And I can still add a layer mask to this to control the fact that I don't want all of these areas to be adjusted the same way. Okay, so just a couple things to be aware of. Typically I have these things on another monitor, but for this I really can't because of the video. So we can create layer masks. Anytime you do a layer mask, I prefer doing the stack. And the same thing with the adjustment layer, do the adjustment stack. Okay, we could also shift the hue, hue saturation value, hue saturation lightness. We could do a grade, gamma, brightness. You know, there's a lot of different things we could adjust inside here for that coloration to tweak what it's going to look like. All right. So we have our rust layer, or our base layer, we have our rust layer, and then we would have one more layer, and I call this the chips layer. Call it chips and scuffs, whatever you want to call it. But this layer is all of these little areas here on the black where this thing has kind of been chipped off a bit. Okay. So you'll see a lot of it's on the edges. There's a lot right on the edges going all the way around. Edges here, edges there. Okay, it's typically where the lightsaber has been scuffed or scratched or whatever. Okay, especially like in battle or whatever, they've been screwing around with it. So let's go to one of these black areas, and for this I'm just going to image manager. There we go. Bring in my metal. And my metal is here, it's just really transparent right now. And I'm just going to paint a little area like that. Okay. Now, I don't want to go, again, all over crazy with this. I just want to paint these little areas that really kind of lend itself to that. There we go. So here I'm in this side view. So you can see how I can paint right along that edge too to give it that same kind of look. Now again, it'd be a little bit trickier to do if I was in another view. And I'm also holding shift, and that's constraining it so that it goes straight. Oops. I have to paint first, then hold shift. There we go. Alright, so now you can see the little scuff mark there. Now it is a bit too perfect. So I have to also switch to the top view. Oops. There it is. Now I'm painting the top view as well. And you'll see that once you understand the basic concepts of this, that this process just becomes a lot more fun. It becomes a lot more of what do you want this thing to look like and going from there. Let me turn my bar off here. Okay, so you can see how nice that's kind of looking. Go through and add a little bit more scuff to this. There we go. Alright, and this stage is really the funnest stage because you really get the ability to go through and tell a little bit of story. Okay, just be careful of replication and where you put things. I don't want to like evenly space the scuff marks out because that doesn't really make sense. Okay, whatever I do to one side, I want to do to the other side. Okay, not the exact same thing, obviously, but just some sort of texture there. Oops, S, there we go. Come in here, and again, I'm painting just some scuff lines. And again, if it's not perfect, we can always adjust what that looks like afterwards. Okay. Right, there we go. So you're going to go through the entire thing and just start painting up these little scuff marks as well. So by the time you're done with this, you'll probably have, let's turn these other ones off. Remove layers, yes. Well, this new base is not going away. Remove layers. Oh, it's locked. There we go. There we go. Alright, so you should have 3 layers. You should have a base layer, your rust layer, and then your chips and scuff layer. Okay, so I'm just going to save this file, and obviously you want to make sure you go through these steps before going on to these last steps. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to show in this video is just exporting this stuff out. There we go. Alright, so here's the one that I've finished texturing. It's still loading. There it goes. Okay, and it's going to take a minute. It's actually going through and loading up all the textures. Right now they look kind of blotchy because it's doing a low-res preview. Then it's going to obviously come in and clean those up. Okay, so I've gone through and I've painted all of this stuff here. And in this area, I've used a lot of different brushes. Okay, I didn't stick with just the metal here. I went through and found some organic brushes that worked pretty good. I think the sponge brush worked good. I also found Brad's new brushes that I found online, some scratches that I've put in here too. And I've just used those all over this thing to give it just a nice coloration. Okay, and so it really gives it a nice story to this. Now you have to use your imagination to as you're painting this, because when you bring this into Photoshop or Maya, whichever program you're using, when you bring this into Photoshop, you have to Maya. One of these days, you have to go through and visualize what it's going to look like when it renders. So I know that this is going to look more glassy. That would look more glassy. This brushed metal here would look more brushed and reflective. This black would be pretty much like the black looks, but obviously look more reflective than it is. Okay, so that's what we want to do. All right, so what I need to do is I need to export out my maps. Okay, so all of these textures that we painted here, all these, I need to take and send out. So I'm going to grab all of these, I'm going to right click, and I'm going to say export flattened. And it'll say export all layers flattened. Yes. So that's going to say, where do you want to put these? So I'm going to make a folder. I like to put this in a separate folder and keep it separated from all my other stuff. So it's going inside source, instructional. Let me just go back. It's going inside source, new instructional. That way I can keep these separated. And it's going to be say colored. It's going to say color flattened. That's what I want it to be called. Okay. And it's going to export alpha channels keep. We don't need any alpha channels, but I'll just leave it on. There shouldn't be any. I'm going to say export all patches. Okay. I can also do export selected patches if I realize I wanted to tweak something from Photoshop from Mari to Maya. Okay, so this is going through the process of exporting out all my patches. You can see the information happening down here. This process could take about 15 minutes or so for everything to work. Once it does, then we're going to see that we have all of our stuff ready to go. We'll have a bunch of textures inside there. Now, this is basically taking all the stuff that it looks like, whatever it looks like, and flattening it into one image that we can use inside of Maya. I also want to come back and grab some of my other layers, export those out as a secondary export that I can use as my bump map. Okay, so I'm going to let this go through, and I'll come back and we'll export out the other one. Alright, so it's done. There it goes. And it's exported them. So if we go to my desktop, and like I said, I put them inside my source folder. Oops. And new instructional. And here are all those textures that it exported. Okay, these are going to vary in size depending on how much stuff we have in each one of these. If I look at the details of this, you'll see that the biggest one is 23 megabytes for that. Smallest one is 1 kilobyte for that. Okay, so it does a pretty good job of managing, what we actually need out of here. It's not going to export a bunch or however many patches we have times 23. Just exports what we need. Okay, so now I need to go through and figure out what my other stuff is going to be. So I'm going to go through and say, if I take this base texture off, just so we can see it, I get this other base. I don't want that base on. I have 2 bases on this one just to play around. I was testing some stuff out. So I have this rust here, and I have these scuff marks. Okay, so I'm going to export both of these as one. So I'm just going to grab both of these. I'm going to right click, export flattened. I'm going to say export selected layers flattened. And instead of this being called color, I'm going to call it bump. There we go. And export all patches. And then again, it's going to go through, and any patches that were affected by that will be exported with that bump map. Okay, so I'm just going to let it go through. And then once it's done, we'll take a look at that. All right, so there we go. So now that's exported out. So now inside this folder, I have a color map and I have a bump map. Now the bump map is going to look kind of crazy depending on where it's hitting these certain areas. All right. Let me sort these by name. Bump. There we go. So that one, obviously, we can tell exactly where the bump is happening. Okay. Some of these other ones might be stuff like the screws, where the UVs are just all over the place. Right. So that's all we're going to be doing in this video. In the next video, we'll be taking this back into Maya, our stuff, and sending it out. Okay. Or setting it up so that the shaders are all set up correctly. All right. Now, just as a bonus thing here, let's save this and close it. Close. And if you want to back up your stuff, here's how you back it up. You click on your item and you say archive. Okay. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to write out all of those textures that it needs to save this project so you can open the archive, which is this next button here, on another computer. So archive, open archive. You could also copy it if you decide you want to try something different in that one, okay, which is kind of neat. So 2 buttons you really need to have. You can't just take your Mari file because there's a lot of other stuff that goes into utilizing that Mari file and making it work. All those textures that we painted and whatnot. Okay, so that's where we're going to be. Next time we'll go into Maya and start putting it all together.